Hey guys, tonight we begin with something so bleak, so cosmically unfair, so spectacularly miserable, that it makes every terrible Monday morning you've ever had feel like a spa day. We're talking about 536 AD, the year a mysterious fog swallowed the sun, crops died across 3 continents, temperatures plummeted in the middle of summer, and historians have since declared it, and I want you to hear this clearly, the worst year in human history. Not a bad year. The worst year ever. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft white noise, and go ahead and pull your blanket up because tonight's story is cold. Genuinely, historically, cosmically cold. And listen, if any of you suggested this topic in the comments, thank you. Truly, you have excellent taste in catastrophe. Now go ahead and settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. You're safe. You're warm. You're not. And this is important living in 6th century Europe. That alone is worth savouring. But before we begin, let's just ask a few questions. Have you ever had a summer where it felt like the sun forgot to show up? Have you ever watched your entire lunch disappear and wondered if there would be more? Have you ever had a neighbour who just wouldn't stop coughing ominously for 3 years straight? Have you ever tried to explain to your family that no, this is not a normal famine. This one comes with a volcanic winter and a plague. And yes, it will get worse before it gets better. Could you survive without sunlight for 18 months? Without a harvest? Without any of the 10 things you currently take for granted every single morning? Would you still be standing after a decade of darkness, disease, and bread made from tree bark? Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 536. It is spring, technically, but the sun hasn't been seen clearly in weeks. The air smells faintly of ash. Your crops look wrong, and there is a fog on the horizon that nobody can explain. Somewhere to the north, a volcano has changed everything, and you have absolutely no idea yet. Good luck. Let's start at the beginning, or rather, at the vanishing. Sometime in early 536, a dense, dry fog crept across Europe, the Middle East and parts of Asia, and simply refused to leave. Not a storm, not clouds, just a pale, suffocating haze that sat in the sky like a bad houseguest who'd eaten all the food and shown no signs of leaving. Contemporary writers were baffled. The Byzantine historian Procopius described it as a sun that gave off light without brightness, like a sun that had technically showed up to work but was clearly phoning it in. Crops still stood in the fields, people still walked outside, but the warmth was gone, the light was wrong, and somewhere in the back of every farmer's brain, a very quiet, very rational alarm was beginning to ring. The fog didn't behave the way fogs were supposed to behave. Normal fogs burned off by mid-morning. This one didn't. It thinned during the day and thickened again at night, and after a few weeks of this, people stopped expecting it to clear. You'd wake up, walk outside, squint at a sky that was bright but somehow dim, like someone had smeared petroleum jelly across the entire heavens, and then go about your day with the gnawing, unshakable sense that something was wrong with the world and nobody could tell you what. Writers across 3 continents recorded it independently, which is one of the things that makes it so striking. This wasn't a regional weather event. In Syria, the chronicler John of Ephesus wrote of a sun that seemed stripped of its power. In Italy, the scholar Cassiodorus noted that the year felt as though it had lost its seasons entirely, that spring had no joy in it, summer no heat, autumn no fruit. In China, official records documented dry fogs and failed harvests. In Ireland, monks noted the cold with the measured bewilderment of people who'd seen a lot of cold, but nothing quite like this. For ordinary people, peasants, shepherds, village traders, the fog was deeply unsettling in a way that went beyond the practical. The sun was not just a heat source in the 6th century, it was a theological statement. It rose because God made it rise. It warmed the earth because that was the covenant. A sun that appeared but refused to warm was a sun that was somehow broken, and a broken sun was a theological problem of the highest possible order. Priests were consulted, prayers were offered. People looked at the sky and waited for an explanation that wouldn't come for another 1200 years. The practical effects were immediate. Plants photosynthesize. Less light means less growth, which means thinner crops, which means shorter animals, which means less of everything that 6th century life was built on. It was a cascade that started in the sky and ended very quickly in the stomach. You wouldn't have understood the mechanism even if someone had explained it, but you would have understood the result. Your barley was coming in wrong, your peas were yellowed at the edges, your wheat was short and pale and giving you the uneasy feeling that this year was going to require some difficult decisions. And here's the part nobody talks about. The part that sits quietly underneath all the historical record. The fog was frightening. Not in the way that a wolf or a raider was frightening. Sudden, loud, identifiable. It was frightening the way that slow wrongness is frightening. The way that watching something reliable become unreliable is frightening. The sun had always risen. It had always warmed. And now it hadn't. For months. And the fog just sat there, pale and patient, like it had nowhere better to be. Which, as it turned out, it didn't. Here's the part where scientists, 1200 years later, finally worked out what happened. The culprit behind 536's misery wasn't a plague, a war, or a particularly vengeful deity, though all three would eventually show up. It was a volcano, a massive, catastrophic eruption, likely in Iceland, possibly in North America, that blasted enormous quantities of sulfur and ash into the stratosphere. Up there, those particles did what volcanic particles do. They spread, they reflected sunlight back into space, and they turned the entire northern hemisphere into a slow-motion refrigerator. You know how you can dim a light by putting a shade over it? Imagine doing that to the actual sun. Now imagine the shade is made of sulfuric acid and covers most of the known world. That was 536. The eruption itself would have been extraordinary to witness, assuming you were far enough away to survive the witnessing. Volcanic eruptions of this scale are not subtle. They send ash clouds tens of miles into the sky. They shake the earth for hundreds of miles in every direction. They roar. But the most dangerous thing about this particular eruption wasn't the immediate blast radius. It was what got into the stratosphere and stayed there. Sulfur dioxide, once it reaches the upper atmosphere, reacts with water vapour to form tiny sulfate aerosol particles. These particles are too light to fall quickly. They disperse across the globe, and they are extraordinarily good at reflecting incoming solar radiation back into space. Better, frankly, than they have any right to be. A single large eruption can, within months, reduce the amount of solar energy reaching the Earth's surface by enough to drop global temperatures by 1 to 2 degrees. That sounds like rounding error. It is not. It is the difference between a harvest and a famine. The people of 536 had no volcanology. They didn't have the concept of a stratosphere, let alone an understanding of sulfate aerosols. What they had was the fog, the cold, and the creeping, inarticulate certainty that the world had changed in a way that their existing categories couldn't explain. They looked for answers in theology, in omens, in the behaviour of animals. They consulted astrologers and priests. Some of the more practically minded just started rationing. What makes this eruption particularly interesting to modern scientists is that it probably wasn't alone. The ice core record, which we'll get to properly later, suggests a second major eruption, around 540, possibly in the tropics, which compounded the cooling effect just as the first was beginning to ease. 2 volcanic punches in the space of 4 years, landing on a civilization already staggered by the first. The timing was, from the perspective of the 6th century human population, cosmically unkind. Nobody caused this. Nobody could have prevented it. Somewhere, a volcano did what volcanoes do. It released pressure that had been building for centuries in the Earth's crust, and the consequences rippled outward across the entire inhabited world. A shepherd in Ireland, a grain merchant in Constantinople, a rice farmer in China. None of them had any connection to each other, and all of them spent the next decade dealing with the same cold. It is one of the stranger demonstrations of how interconnected the physical world is and has always been, regardless of whether the people living in it knew it. The volcano remains to this day unconfirmed in its specific location. Iceland is the leading candidate based on the ice core evidence. North America has also been proposed. Wherever it was, it didn't leave a calling card, it just left the cold. Summer of 536 did technically happen on the calendar. Out in the actual world, it failed to show up in any meaningful way. Temperatures in Europe and parts of Asia dropped by 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius, which sounds modest until you understand that a single degree of global cooling is enough to destroy agricultural cycles that entire civilizations depend on. In China, there was snow in summer. In Peru, ice cores recorded the sudden chill. In Ireland, tree ring records from that year are some of the most stunted ever measured. Trees that barely grew at all, as if they looked outside, saw what was happening, and quietly decided not to bother. Crops withered. Livestock struggled. Peasants stood in their fields in what should have been July, wearing their winter cloaks, watching their grain come in thin and pale and wrong, and wondering what they had done to deserve this. The grain calendar in the 6th century was rigid and unforgiving. Planting happened in spring when the soil reached a certain temperature. Growth happened through summer when the days were long and warm. Harvest happened in late summer and autumn, and what you brought in then was what you lived on until the next year. There was no flexibility built into this system, no backup plan, no emergency reserves managed by a government agency. You planted, you grew, you harvested, and then you survived on what you had. Remove any one of those stages and the whole sequence failed. Summer 536 removed the middle stage almost entirely. The days were long, the Earth still tilted correctly on its axis, the calendar still said July, but the warmth simply wasn't there. Grain needs heat to fill out its kernels. Without it, the stalks grew, but the heads were thin. The yield was a fraction of normal, and what little did come in was weak enough to rot faster in storage. A normal harvest might carry a family of 5 through 8 or 9 months. The harvest of 536 in the worst affected regions carried them through 3. Animals felt it too. Pastures that should have been lush and green through the summer months were sparse and late. Cattle that should have been fattening on summer grass came to autumn thin. The dairy production that supplemented grain in the diet, milk, butter, cheese, dropped sharply. Pigs that were supposed to be rooting through autumn forest floors found slim pickings. The entire food web from the grass up was running at reduced capacity, and the humans at the top of it were going to feel every step of that reduction. Cassiodorus, writing in Italy in 536, described the season with an elegant despair that is almost admirable given the circumstances. He noted that the year seemed to lack its proper order, that the seasons had forgotten their duties. He was a sophisticated man, a scholar and administrator, and even he had no framework for what was happening. He observed it precisely, described it beautifully, and understood it not at all. What he could see, what everyone could see, was the practical consequence: less food, colder nights, and a general atmosphere of dread that settled over the continent like a second fog, this one invisible and entirely internal. You went to bed in summer wearing wool. You woke up to grey skies. You walked to your field and looked at your grain and did the arithmetic. The arithmetic was bad. It had been bad for months, and the cold, inexplicably, was not leaving. Food security in the 6th century was already a system with about the structural integrity of a wet cardboard box. Most people ate what they grew, traded locally for what they couldn't, and operated on margins so thin that a single bad harvest was a genuine crisis. Now take that system and remove the sun for 18 months. The harvests of 536 were catastrophic across Europe and the Middle East. What little grew was weak, undersized and vulnerable to disease. Grain stores that were supposed to carry communities through winter were depleted by summer. The desperate calculus that medieval and pre-medieval farming communities ran every autumn. Do we have enough? Will it stretch? Who gets less? Now had answers that nobody wanted to hear. People began to eat things they wouldn't normally eat. They ground bark, they boiled leather, they stripped fields of anything green. Hunger, quiet and systematic, moved through villages like a slow tide. The grain store was the centre of every farming household's survival strategy. You harvested in autumn, you threshed and dried the grain, you stored it in the driest, most rodent-resistant space you had, and you portioned it out through winter and spring until the next growing season. A good store, carefully managed, gave you confidence. A bad harvest meant drawing down that store faster than it was meant to be drawn, which meant arriving at spring thinner, weaker, and with less seed grain to plant for next year. 536's harvest didn't just draw the store down faster, it barely filled it to begin with. By late winter of 536 into 537, communities that had always been self-sufficient were beginning to make the kinds of decisions that hunger forces. Seed grain, the portion of the harvest that was supposed to go back into the ground in spring, began to be eaten. This is the hunger equivalent of burning your furniture to stay warm. It solves the immediate problem and guarantees a worse one. A family that eats their seed grain survives this winter, but plants almost nothing in spring, which means the next harvest is a fraction of even the thin one they just had, and there was nowhere to turn for relief that didn't have the same problem. Your neighbour had the same harvest you did. The nearest town had the same harvest too. Trade could move grain from regions of surplus to regions of shortage, but the surplus regions of 536 were themselves smaller than usual, and the merchants who moved that grain had their own arithmetic to run. Prices rose. They rose to levels that put grain entirely beyond the reach of peasant families, which is where the majority of the population sat. Creativity in famine conditions takes dark forms. Inner bark, specifically the cambium layer of certain trees, could be dried and ground into a flour of sorts. It tasted the way you would expect tree bark to taste, and it provided some calories, though not many. Acorns, which in normal years were left to the pigs, were collected and processed, soaked repeatedly to remove the bitter tannins, then dried and ground. Wild plants that would normally be ignored were suddenly cuisine. Nettles, sorrel, anything green enough to look like food. The hunger was quiet and it was constant, and it did what sustained hunger always does to human beings. It narrowed the world. When you're hungry enough, the future shrinks to the next meal, the next day, the immediate horizon. The elaborate social and spiritual life of a 6th century village didn't disappear, but it became background noise behind the single dominant question of whether there would be enough to get through the week. One of the most reliable ways to measure how badly a society is suffering is to look at what food costs. And in the years following 536, prices for basic staples, grain, bread, dried legumes, spiked to levels that put them entirely beyond the reach of the poor. Markets that once hummed with reasonable barter and trade became frantic, desperate places where a sack of grain cost what a labourer might earn in a week, then 2 weeks, then more. The wealthy hoarded, merchants gouged. Rulers who might have intervened were often fighting their own resource crises. And at the bottom of the pile, ordinary people, farmers, craftspeople, servants, found themselves doing the grim arithmetic of survival. What can we sell? What can we eat? What do we give up first? Price inflation in a famine is a cruelty that works by the same mathematics as everything else. Less supply, same demand, or rather, more desperate demand means prices rise. This is not a conspiracy. It doesn't require anyone to be villainous, though villains certainly participated. It's just supply and demand doing its cold, indifferent work on a population that has no slack in its budget to absorb a price increase of any size, let alone one of this magnitude. In Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, the authorities attempted to manage grain distribution as the crisis deepened. The city had a tradition of maintaining public grain stores, a legacy of the Roman annona system, which had kept the urban poor fed for centuries. But those stores were never designed to absorb the kind of multi-year shortfall that 536 initiated. Officials who tried to hold prices down created black markets. Officials who let prices rise left the poor to starve. There was no good option, only a choice between different flavours of inadequate. Out in the countryside, the market dynamics played out at the village level, which meant they were more personal and therefore, in some ways, more brutal. A miller who still had grain knew exactly how much his neighbours needed it. A landowner sitting on stored reserves from previous good years could name his price, and he did. The social fabric that normally held communities together, reciprocity, reputation, the understanding that you might need a favour next year stretched and in some cases snapped entirely under the pressure of extreme scarcity. What people sold to buy food tells you everything about where they were in the crisis. First went the non-essentials, whatever small luxuries a peasant household might have accumulated. Then went the tools, an axe, a good hoe, a set of metal harness fittings. These things had value and could be traded for grain. But selling your tools meant you couldn't farm properly next season, which meant next year's harvest would be smaller, which meant you'd have less again. Then came the animals. Selling the ox to buy bread was a decision that echoed forward for years, and when the tools and the animals were gone, people sold their labour, themselves. Arrangements that looked uncomfortably like debt bondage, or outright bondage, became more common as desperate families traded future freedom for present food. The powerful got more powerful. The poor got poorer and less free. Famine is, among its many other unpleasantnesses, one of the most efficient engines for economic inequality ever devised. The markets of 536 were, in this way, a mirror held up to the entire social structure of the age. They showed exactly who had buffers and who didn't, who had options and who had run out of them. A wealthy landowner with a well-stocked granary and the legal power to collect rent in grain sat at the top of the crisis, with his position intact and possibly improved. A free peasant with a small plot and a thin harvest sat in the middle, selling everything he owned in roughly the order of his desperation. And at the bottom, people who had already been operating on the margins before the fog rolled in found themselves with no remaining moves. The price of a loaf in 536 was the price of everything. And for many people it turned out that price was more than they had. In any famine, the first to suffer most visibly are children, and 536 was no exception. Skeletal analysis from burial sites across Europe dating to this period shows the telltale signs of severe nutritional stress: stunted growth, bone lesions, the physical record of a body that simply didn't have enough to build itself properly. Medieval communities loved their children fiercely and pragmatically. Children were labour, legacy, and the entire point of surviving winter. Watching them go quiet, watching them grow thin, watching them develop the glassy eyes and hollow cheeks of malnutrition while you stood in a field that should have been producing grain but wasn't, is the kind of sustained helplessness that doesn't make it into the official historical record. It lives instead in the archaeology, in the small bones, in the graves that are dated just a little too close together. Child nutrition in the 6th century was already fragile by modern standards. Weaning happened early, often around 1 to 2 years, and after that a child ate what the household ate, primarily grain-based foods with occasional protein from eggs, dairy or legumes. A diet that was nutritionally borderline in good years became critically inadequate in bad ones. The specific nutrients that children need to develop bone density, immune function, and cognitive capacity are exactly the nutrients that disappear first in a famine: protein, fat, vitamins A and D. The bones remember. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from 6th century burial sites in Britain, in Italy, in parts of the Byzantine East, shows evidence of Harris lines in the long bones, which are growth arrest markers caused by periods of severe nutritional stress. They look, under X-ray, like faint horizontal lines across the bone shaft, each one a record of a period when the body stopped growing because it didn't have enough to grow with. Some children's remains from this period show multiple lines, which tells you they went through multiple episodes of starvation, recovered partially, and were hit again. Mothers in this period faced an impossible triage. Breast milk requires calories to produce, which means a nursing mother who is herself malnourished produces less milk of lower quality, which means the infant is underfed. The standard 6th century response was to wean earlier when food was short, to free the mother's caloric budget for other children, but an early weaned infant in a famine household was being moved from the breast onto the same thin gruel that everyone else was eating, which was not adequate for a 1-year-old. Orphan children in famine conditions had almost no viable options. The community network of extended family and neighbours that might normally absorb them was itself under strain. Some were taken in anyway because people are people, and 6th century communities had strong norms of mutual obligation, especially toward children. Others were abandoned, left at churches or on the roads, in the desperate hope that someone better positioned might take them. The historical record is thin here, because the victims were small and left few documents, but the archaeology speaks in its quiet, meticulous way, and what it says about the children of 536 is not easy to hear. What the bones can't show you is what happened in between the growth arrest lines, the normal childhood that flickered back on during brief periods of recovery, only to be interrupted again. The playing, the learning of small skills, the watching of adults for clues about how the world worked. Those children grew up understanding, in their bones as much as in their minds, that a world was not reliable, that warmth and food were not guaranteed, that the job of being alive required constant vigilance and considerable luck. They became the adults who rebuilt. They became the parents who passed on an extremely practical understanding of resilience. The 6th century did not produce optimists, but it produced survivors, and the two things are not the same. 536 did not find the Byzantine Empire in its finest hour. Emperor Justinian I had spent the previous decade attempting to reconquer the Western Roman territories, Italy, North Africa, part of Spain, in a grand and expensive project historians call the Justinianic Reconquest. It was going reasonably well, in the way that enormously costly military campaigns occasionally do, right up until the sky went dark. Suddenly, the supply lines that fed armies across the Mediterranean were under strain. Tax revenues fell as agricultural production collapsed. Plague, which would arrive with devastating timing in 541, was already beginning to simmer at the edges of the empire. Justinian, a man of considerable intelligence and ambition, found himself trying to hold together a vast, expensive, multi-front enterprise, while the climate turned hostile and his population began to starve. The reconquest stumbled. History, as it often does, handed a great man a bill he hadn't budgeted for. Justinian was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most capable and ambitious emperors in Byzantine history. He had reformed the legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, still the basis of many legal systems today. He had built the Hagia Sophia. He had pushed the empire's borders outward with a combination of military force and diplomatic pressure that would have impressed any of his predecessors. He was not, in other words, a man accustomed to being outmaneuvered, but a volcanic winter doesn't respond to diplomacy, and famines don't care about your legal reforms. The practical problem was money. Byzantine military operations were expensive, soldiers needed to be paid, supplied and equipped, and the money for all of that came primarily from agricultural taxation. When harvests failed across the empire's core territories, Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, the tax base contracted sharply. Justinian's government found itself trying to finance a multi-front war on declining revenue while simultaneously managing food shortages in its major cities. The resulting fiscal pressure was significant enough that even the ambitious building programs of the period slowed. In Italy, the war against the Ostrogoths, which had looked like it might reach a quick conclusion in the early 530s, dragged on through the decade. The Byzantine armies, undersupplied and occasionally underpaid, struggled to maintain momentum. The Ostrogoths, who had their own famine problems but were fighting on their home territory, proved more resilient than expected. What should have been a swift reconquest turned into a grinding multi-decade war that exhausted both sides and left Italy economically devastated. And Justinian, sitting in Constantinople managing all of this from the centre, faced the specific challenge of every leader in a crisis, making decisions with incomplete information about a situation that was changing faster than his messengers could report. He knew there was famine. He knew there was unrest. He knew his armies in Italy were struggling. He did not know that in 5 years a plague would arrive that would kill a third of the population of his capital city, or that second eruption would extend the cooling effect for another decade. He was, in the most basic sense, doing his best with what he had. History would judge him harshly anyway, which is more or less what history does. What is perhaps most striking about Justinian's reign, viewed across this period, is the sheer persistence of it. A lesser emperor, or a luckier one, might have retrenched, cancelled the Italian campaign, and focused on keeping the core of the empire fed. Justinian kept pushing. He kept building. He kept legislating. Whether this was visionary stubbornness or ordinary pig-headedness dressed in imperial purple is a question historians have been debating for 15 centuries. What is not debatable is the result. An empire that entered the period of crisis large and expensive, and came out of it smaller, poorer, and irrevocably changed. The reconquest succeeded technically. Rome was retaken. Africa was held. But the cost was ruinous, and the famine and plague that ran alongside the military campaigns ensured that the victory, when it came, was not the triumphant restoration Justinian had imagined. It was a wreck with a flag planted in it. The volcanic winter of 536 didn't arrive alone. In its wake, softened by famine, weakened by hunger, moving along the same trade routes that spread grain and silk and amber, came something worse. Historians call it the Plague of Justinian, and it arrived in 541 with the confidence of a catastrophe that knows it's been expected. It was bubonic plague, the same Yersinia pestis bacterium that would resurface 800 years later as the Black Death. And it tore through Constantinople at its peak, allegedly killing up to 5,000 people a day. The city ran out of places to put the dead. Bodies were stacked in towers, loaded onto ships and pushed out to sea. Justinian himself contracted it and survived, which history may or may not have appreciated depending on your perspective. For ordinary people, the plague arrived not as a single blow, but as a recurring nightmare, flaring, retreating, returning, generation after generation for the next 2 centuries. The plague's arrival in Constantinople was not a surprise to everyone. It had been working its way up from Egypt, moving along grain routes, leaving the trail of dead that Yersinia pestis leaves wherever it finds a susceptible population. Procopius, who was in Constantinople when it arrived and survived to write about it, noted that there had been rumours from the south for some time, but rumours of distant death are easy to discount, especially when you are already managing a famine and a war. What made the plague of 541 so catastrophically effective was the combination of factors that preceded it. 5 years of nutritional stress had left the urban and rural population of the empire with compromised immune function. Malnutrition doesn't just make you hungry, it systematically degrades the biological systems that fight infection. The same people who had spent half a decade not eating enough were now being asked to fight a bacterium that a well-nourished immune system struggled to contain, let alone a depleted one. The death toll estimates for the plague of Justinian are contested, as death toll estimates for ancient plagues always are, but the scholarly consensus suggests it killed somewhere between 25 and 50% of the population of the Eastern Mediterranean over its first decade. In a world with no understanding of contagion, no quarantine infrastructure, and no treatment that worked, those numbers are not surprising. They are nonetheless staggering. What Procopius describes in his account of the plague in Constantinople is not the dramatic, cinematic plague of later imagination. It is mundane horror, the horror of a city that fills up faster than it can empty. Gravediggers who died before they finished digging, bodies left in streets because there was no one to move them, boats loaded with corpses and pushed offshore because the city had run out of burial space. The infrastructure of death which every civilization maintains quietly in the background simply failed to scale to what was being asked of it. Justinian himself fell ill. The swollen lymph nodes, the fever, the full symptom set of bubonic plague, and recovered, which was genuinely remarkable, and which he and his court interpreted as divine favour. Perhaps it was, or perhaps he was among the roughly half of plague patients who survived without any intervention whatsoever, which is the other explanation, and somewhat less theologically satisfying. Let's talk about what getting the plague actually felt like in the 6th century, because it was not subtle, and it was not quick, and it was not something you could misidentify as a bad cold. The bubonic form, the most common, arrived with sudden fever, chills, and a stabbing headache that made you immediately suspect this was not going to be a good week. Within a day or two came the buboes, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpit or neck, growing to the size of eggs or apples, hot to the touch, agonizing to move near. Some burst, some didn't. Either way, you were running out of options. The septicemic form moved faster and darker, spreading through the bloodstream, causing the skin to blacken and die. The pneumonic form travelled through the air. Medical treatment in the 6th century consisted largely of prayer, poultices, and physicians who understood that something was very wrong, but had no framework whatsoever to explain why. You were bled, purged, and prayed over. Statistically, about half of the people who contracted it died. The other half lived to watch it come back. The progression of bubonic plague in a 6th century patient had a terrible and predictable rhythm. Day 1. Sudden onset fever, usually in the evening, accompanied by chills so severe that multiple heavy blankets offered no relief. Headache that felt, by all surviving accounts, like something trying to exit through the skull. Profound weakness, the kind that makes lifting an arm feel like a serious project. You took to your bed, which in 541 meant a straw pallet on an earthen floor, and your family gathered around you with the specific expression that meant they were frightened, but didn't want to show it. Day 2 or 3, the bubo appeared. The lymph node closest to the site of the flea bite, usually groin, armpit or neck, began to swell with the speed of something that has no business swelling that fast. Within hours it was the size of a walnut. Within a day, an apple. The swelling was taut and hot and exquisitely painful, and it announced, to anyone who had seen plague before, exactly what was happening. In 541, most people in Constantinople were seeing it for the first time. In subsequent years, after the plague had made its first pass through the population, survivors recognized it with the grim familiarity of a recurring bad dream. Procopius noted that the plague affected the mind as well as the body, that some patients became delirious, that others fell into a deep stupor, that some experienced visions. This tracks with what we know about plague from later, better documented outbreaks. The fever can reach levels that cause neurological effects, and the septicemic form in particular can produce skin discoloration and breakdown that was, to anyone watching, a darkly visual way to die. If you survived, and roughly half of bubonic plague patients did, you emerged from the experience physically depleted, immune to this particular strain of Yersinia pestis, and alive in a world with significantly fewer people in it than there had been a week ago. You came back to a house that might have fewer occupants. You returned to a workshop, a farm, a market where some of the familiar faces were simply gone. The social texture of life contracted with each wave of the plague, and each contraction left the survivors redistributing themselves into the spaces the dead had left, which was both practically necessary and quietly terrible. Here is an uncomfortable truth about one of the most consequential ecological relationships in human history. Nobody in the 6th century understood that rats and fleas were killing them. The mechanism was invisible. The flea bit the infected rat. The rat died. The flea, suddenly homeless and hungry, jumped to the nearest warm body, which was you, sleeping on your straw mattress, bundled against the volcanic cold, bit you, and introduced Yersinia pestis directly into your bloodstream. You had no idea. You didn't know what a bacterium was. You didn't know that the rat problem in your grain store was the same problem as the swollen lump under your arm. Rats were everywhere in 6th century settlements, in the walls, in the food stores, on the ships that moved grain from Egypt to Constantinople to Rome. They were so omnipresent that nobody really saw them as a threat. They were just part of the texture of daily life, like mud and smoke and the smell of someone else's livestock. The flea was even more invisible. It was the most consequential insect in European history, and it was too small to accuse. The black rat, Rattus rattus, had arrived in Europe from Asia sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, moving along the same trade routes that moved everything else. By the 6th century, it was thoroughly established in Mediterranean port cities, granaries, ships, and any human settlement large enough to produce the food waste that rats depended on. It was, from a rat's perspective, a golden age. Grain stores were abundant, human populations were dense, shipping was regular and international. The conditions for a plague reservoir, a stable population of infected rodents from which Yersinia pestis could periodically jump to humans, were essentially ideal. The flea in question, Xenosilla chiopis, is a specialist. It prefers rats. It feeds on rats, reproduces on rats, lives its entire life in the fur of rats if the rat in question cooperates. When the rat dies, as infected rats do, quickly and reliably, the flea finds itself without a host and suddenly very hungry. It jumps to the nearest available warm-blooded creature. If that creature is another rat, the infection spreads within the rat population. If that creature is human sleeping nearby, the Yersinia pestis in the flea's gut gets deposited into the bite wound, and the plague begins its work. What made this mechanism particularly devastating in the context of 536 onward was the famine. Famines move humans and animals together. When food is scarce, people protect their grain stores more fiercely and keep them closer, which means rats, which means fleas, which means increased proximity to the plague reservoir at exactly the moment when human immune systems were at their most depleted. It is, in retrospect, a perfect epidemiological setup. The famine created the conditions for the plague. The plague killed the people the famine had weakened. The two catastrophes were not separate, they were a system. each one amplifying the other. In the great cities, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, the rat population had centuries of urban infrastructure to exploit. Ships arriving from plague-endemic regions of Africa brought infected rat populations with them, and the port cities were the first and hardest hit, the disease then spreading inland along the same roads that moved people and goods. A 6th century resident of Constantinople, watching their neighbour develop a bubo, would have no way of knowing that the answer to why was a flea that had jumped from a dead rat on a grain ship from Egypt. The chain was simply too long and too small to see. Constantinople in 541 was the greatest city in the Western world, a population of perhaps 500,000 people crammed into a peninsula on the Bosphorus, connected by trade to Egypt, Syria, Persia, and beyond. It was magnificent, cosmopolitan, and extraordinarily vulnerable to exactly the kind of pandemic that was about to hit it. When the plague arrived via grain ships from Egypt, it spread through the city with terrifying speed. The markets went quiet, the streets emptied. The emperor's administration, which ran on bureaucracy and manpower and the constant movement of people and paper, began to stall. Procopius described bodies piled in houses where everyone had died, houses the living were afraid to enter. The harbours filled with ships nobody was sailing. Bread prices spiked again, because the bakers were dying too. A city that had survived sieges, earthquakes, and political upheaval found itself hollowed out from within, not by an army, but by something that needed no weapons at all. Constantinople's greatest strength, the density of its population, and the intensity of its trade connections was also, in a pandemic, its greatest vulnerability. 500,000 people living within a few square miles meant that the infectious chain from one household to the next was extremely short. The same maritime network that brought grain, silk, spices, and luxury goods from across the known world also delivered infected fleas in the holds of ships and infected rats in the grain sacks. A city that was the hub of everything was also the hub of the plague. It arrived everywhere else later. It arrived in Constantinople first. The administrative machinery of the Byzantine Empire was concentrated here, and as the plague moved through the population, that machinery began to seize up in ways that had immediate practical consequences far beyond the city walls. Tax collection, which required live collectors, stalled. Military payrolls, which required live administrators, fell behind. The grain distribution system that the city depended on to keep its vast population fed required coordination at every level: ships, harbours, warehouses, distribution points, record keepers, and every level was losing people. A city of 500,000 does not simply absorb the loss of tens of thousands of its functionaries and carry on as normal. Procopius, who lived through it and wrote about it with the sober clarity of someone who had clearly decided that accuracy was the only appropriate response to events this extreme, described the specific texture of the city's collapse in terms that are recognizable across any plague account from any era. The healthy stopped visiting the sick, not out of indifference but out of terror, which meant the sick died without company and the bodies piled up in locked rooms. The streets, which in normal times were clogged with the commercial traffic of the empire's greatest city, went quiet in a way that was itself a kind of sound, the sound of everything stopping at once. Justinian, to his credit, attempted to manage the crisis with organizational energy. He established officials specifically tasked with clearing bodies and overseeing burials. He drew on the imperial treasury to fund emergency grain distribution. He kept his government functioning more or less, even through his own illness. But there are limits to what administration can do against a pandemic that is moving faster than any organizational response. The bodies fill the towers built to hold them. The towers ran out of space. The ships loaded with the dead pushed off from the harbour and drifted into the Bosphorus, which is not a dignified end for the citizens of the greatest city in the world, but dignity was one of the many things that 541 could not reliably provide. Somewhere between the volcanic winter and the plague, the ordinary farmer of 6th century Europe and the Middle East found themselves facing a decision that had no good answer. Stay or go. Stay and risk starvation in a field that wasn't producing. Stay and risk plague in a village where the neighbour's house had gone silent. Or go, abandon the land your family had worked for generations, leave behind the home and the tools and the livestock you couldn't carry, and walk towards somewhere, anywhere, that might have food, safety, distance from the dying. Mass migration in the ancient and early medieval world wasn't the dramatic cinematic event we sometimes imagine. It was mostly exhausted people walking, carrying children, carrying seeds, carrying whatever they could lift. Some found better ground. Some walked into plague country without knowing it. Some simply disappeared from the historical record entirely, which is its own kind of answer. The decision to leave the land was not made lightly. In the 6th century, your farm was not just your livelihood, it was your identity, your family's history, your legal standing in the community, and your best available source of food. Leaving meant surrendering all of that simultaneously. It meant walking away from the fruit trees your grandfather had planted, the field boundaries your father had maintained, the neighbours who owed you favours and whom you owed in return. It meant becoming, in the language of the age, a wanderer, which was not a romantic category but a social and legal vulnerability. Wanderers had no protections, no lord obligated to feed or defend them, no community network to fall back on, and yet people left. The archaeological and historical record of the mid-6th century is full of the evidence of departure, settlements abandoned, farmsteads that simply stopped being maintained, roads that show increased traffic in certain directions as populations shifted toward coasts, toward cities, toward anywhere that the rumour of food was stronger than the evidence of famine at home. People are extraordinarily good at tolerating bad situations up to the point where they conclude that movement offers better odds than staying, and then they move. The calculus of staying versus going changed as the decade wore on. In the first year of bad harvests, most people stayed and tightened their belts and told themselves it would be better next year. That is the rational response, because most bad years are followed by better ones. But 536 was not followed by a better year. It was followed by 537, which was nearly as bad, and then by the second eruption, and then by the plague. And at some point along that sequence the calculation flipped for more and more households. Not this year, not next year, not here. What they carried when they went was a study in practical prioritism, seeds if they had any left, a blade of some kind. The children, obviously always the children first, carried on backs when they were too small to walk the distance required. The old and sick were a harder question, and the historical record doesn't dwell on the answer, but you can infer from the archaeology of the period. The graves dug at the edges of abandoned settlements, the remains of people who didn't make it to wherever everyone else went, that not everyone got to leave. Some stayed because they couldn't go, and the field they'd spent their lives tending quietly went back to grass around them. The diet of a 6th century famine survivor requires a certain creative generosity of spirit to appreciate. When grain ran out, you went to the secondary foods, root vegetables, wild greens, anything the forest offered. When those ran out, you went to the tertiary options, which is where things get genuinely grim. Bark bread was real. The inner bark of certain trees, dried and ground, could be mixed with whatever flour remained to stretch it further. It tasted like despair, served warm, but it had calories. Acorns, normally reserved for pigs, were processed into a bitter meal. Snails, frogs, and insects became protein sources for people who had previously considered themselves above such things. Leather could be boiled until it softened enough to chew, which provided almost nothing nutritionally but occupied the mouth and stomach in a way that felt, briefly, like eating. People fed their children before themselves. They ate in the sequence that love dictates, last to the table, least on the plate. Hunger is, among other things, an intensely social experience. The transition through the hierarchy of famine foods happened faster than most people expected, because the problem was not just quantity but timing. Normal wild food sources, berries, mushrooms, game, fish, were seasonal and couldn't be scaled up to feed a famine population. By the time a village of 200 people had stripped the surrounding forest of everything edible, they destroyed the very ecosystem they were depending on for recovery. Overharvesting in famine conditions is a second-order disaster. You survive this month by consuming what would have fed you next season. Hunting intensified dramatically, which created its own problems. Game that was normally regulated by the rights of lords and landowners, deer, boar, certain birds, was increasingly poached by desperate people who had run out of reasons to care about the legal consequences. This created friction between peasants and whatever authorities were still functional, adding a layer of social conflict to the existing physical misery. Getting caught poaching in a famine year meant punishment from a lord who was himself under resource pressure and therefore not inclined toward mercy. It was frankly a lot to navigate on an empty stomach. Water became a critical variable that it hadn't been before, because foraging and emergency food preparation required significant amounts of it. Acorn processing alone, the repeated soaking and rinsing needed to remove enough tannins to make them edible, was labour-intensive and water-intensive. Bark preparation required boiling. Any kind of wild grain or seed processing required water. In communities whose water sources has been contaminated by the crowding and sanitation failures that famine produced, the act of trying to prepare food could itself make you sick, which is the kind of problem that has no good solution and a very predictable outcome. What people remembered afterward, in the accounts that survived, in the oral traditions that eventually made it into written form, was not the specific foods they were eaten in the worst years. It was the silence of meals, the absence of the smells and sounds of ordinary cooking, the particular quality of sitting around a fire with nothing to put on it, and the specific kind of conversation that happens in those moments, or doesn't happen, because some silences are beyond filling. Famine doesn't just empty the stomach, it empties the table, which turns out to be its own kind of loss. When the sun disappears for 18 months and is followed by famine and then plague, the theological implications are significant. In the 6th century, there was no secular framework for catastrophe, no climate science, no epidemiology, no concept of a world that operated according to physical laws rather than divine will. What there was, everywhere, was the deep and pressing question, What did we do to deserve this? In Christian communities across the Byzantine Empire and Europe, the darkness of 536 was interpreted as divine punishment for sin, for heresy, for the failings of rulers, for the moral inadequacy of the age. Clergy preached repentance, monks fasted harder, which given the famine conditions was not necessarily a healthy choice. Churches filled with people praying for the sun to return, for the crops to grow, for God to remember that they were still here, still trying, still desperately attempting to be better than whatever had earned this. The plague, when it came, sharpened the question. Surely this level of suffering meant something. The theological crisis of the mid-6th century was not simply about doubt. Most people did not lose their faith. What happened was stranger, and in some ways more interesting. Faith intensified, splintered, and got creative under pressure. When the ordinary operations of prayer, the regular liturgy, the seasonal cycle of feasts and fasts seemed inadequate to the scale of the disaster, communities reached for more extreme expressions of devotion. Flagellant practices, which would become more widespread during the Black Death centuries later, had earlier roots in exactly this kind of prolonged communal crisis. If ordinary prayer wasn't working, perhaps the problem was insufficient suffering. Perhaps God required a more convincing demonstration of contrition. The institutional church was both a stabilizing force and a stress point during this period. On one hand, monasteries and churches provided real practical relief, food distribution, care for the sick, burial of the dead, the organizational infrastructure for community survival. Bishops coordinated local responses in ways that secular authorities sometimes couldn't, because their authority was less dependent on the agricultural and fiscal systems that the crisis was destroying. The Church was, in a meaningful sense, one of the most resilient institutions in the 6th century, precisely because its power base was spiritual rather than purely material. On the other hand, the Church's explanatory framework for the disaster, punishment, sin, divine will, had a practical side effect that complicated the public health response to the plague. If disease was sent by God, then quarantine was theologically suspect. You were separating yourself from the will of God, or abandoning your neighbour to face divine judgment alone. Processions through plague-infected streets, communal prayers in packed churches, gathering around the sick and dying to offer last rites. All of these were religiously and morally mandatory in a worldview where the plague was a spiritual event, and all of them were epidemiologically catastrophic. This is not a criticism. It is simply what happens when a society's best available explanatory framework is wrong, in ways that have fatal practical consequences. The 6th century did not have better options. What it had was community and ritual, and the stubborn insistence on meaning in the face of events that resisted it, and those things, for what they were worth, kept people from collapsing entirely into the kind of social disintegration that would have made everything worse. Thank goodness for the monks. Genuinely. In a period of almost total social disruption, it was largely monastic communities, insulated to some degree by their walls, their stores, their organisational discipline, who kept writing. The chronicles and annals they produced are sometimes brief, sometimes fragmentary, but they are the thin thread through which we know what 536 felt like from the inside. Irish annals record a failure of bread. Byzantine chronicles describe the dimming of the sun in precise, bewildered terms. A monk named Cassiodorus, writing from Italy, described the spring of 536 in a letter, a sun shorn of its force, a year without a proper summer, crops ripening late and badly. He was trying to explain it to a senator. He couldn't. Nobody could. But they wrote it down, which is one of the most generous things anyone can do for the future, to simply record that this happened, this was real, we were here, and this was what we saw. Monastic communities in the 6th century occupied a peculiar position in the social landscape that turned out to be extremely useful for historical survival. They were geographically stable. A monastery, unlike a farming household or a trading operation, didn't pick up and move when conditions deteriorated. They had libraries and scriptorium traditions, the physical infrastructure for writing and copying texts that secular institutions generally lacked. They had internal discipline that maintained daily rhythms even under pressure. The hours were kept, the offices were sung. The scribe sat at his desk in the morning even when the news from the village outside the walls was frightening. Routine is, it turns out, one of the better defences against despair. The content of what they wrote varies considerably. Some of the chronicle entries from this period are frustratingly terse. A single line noting a famine or a dimming of the sun, as if the monk couldn't bring himself to write more, or didn't have the parchment to spare, or simply didn't have the categories to describe what was happening in adequate detail. Others are longer and more reflective, written by men who were clearly wrestling with what they were witnessing and trying to fit it into a theological and historical framework that explained it as something other than pure random catastrophe. What they collectively produced is something extraordinary. A distributed, multi-perspective account of a global climate event recorded in real time by people who had no idea that what they were observing was global. The Irish monk noting the failure of bread had no knowledge of the Chinese records of summer snow. The Byzantine chronicler describing the dimmed sun had no contact with the Peruvian ice that was simultaneously recording the same temperature drop. They were just writing what they saw. And 12 centuries later, when scientists began to correlate those independent observations with the physical record preserved in ice and tree rings, the pieces fit together with a precision that is still remarkable. The monks wrote because writing was what monks did. It was their vocation, their service, their contribution to the ongoing project of preserving knowledge across time. Most of them had no idea they were documenting a catastrophe that historians would still be analysing 15 centuries later. They thought they were keeping records. They were. They just happened to be keeping the records that would allow the future to understand one of the worst years in the history of the world. Here is one of the genuinely wonderful things about the modern science of historical climate. The evidence doesn't lie. It just waits. Ice cores drilled from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica preserve a chemical record of the atmosphere going back hundreds of thousands of years, layer by layer, year by year. In the ice that formed in 536 and the years immediately following, scientists found an unmistakable volcanic signature, sulfur deposits from a massive eruption, sitting in the record like a fingerprint. Tree rings told the same story. Narrow stressed growth bands from 536, 37, 38, the thinnest in some cases in the past 2,000 years. Dendrochronology, the science of reading tree rings, can date individual years with precision, and what the trees of Europe and North America recorded across those years is a story of cold, stress, and barely survived winter. The people who lived it left words. The trees left math. Together, they make a case that's almost impossible to argue with. Ice core drilling is, in physical terms, one of the more patient scientific procedures humans have developed. You lower a hollow drill into a glacier, retrieve a cylinder of ice, and read it like a geological newspaper, except this newspaper goes back 500,000 years and was written by the atmosphere itself. Each year's snowfall compresses into a distinct layer, and within each layer are the chemical signatures of that year's atmosphere. Dust, sea salt, volcanic aerosols, industrial pollutants in more recent layers, and in earlier ones the sulfate particles that mark major volcanic eruptions with a clarity that requires no interpretation. The sulfate spike in the ice that formed around 536 is visible across multiple ice cores from multiple drilling sites. It is not ambiguous. The Greenland ice cores were the first to catch scientific attention for this period, but the story was confirmed and expanded by Antarctic cores, which showed that whatever eruption caused the event of 536 was large enough to affect both hemispheres, a finding that narrows the likely location of the eruption and confirms its truly global scale. Ice cores from the Swiss Alps, from Iceland, from Canada, all told the same story with their own chemical voices, each one adding a data point to a picture that became increasingly difficult to dispute. Tree rings are a different kind of archive, but equally precise. A tree records each year of its growth in a ring of wood, wide in good years when warmth and moisture were adequate, narrow in bad years when they were not. A frost ring, which occurs when a freeze kills part of the growing tissue during the growing season, leaves a physical scar visible under the microscope. The trees growing in Ireland, in Scandinavia, in the mountains of California, in the ancient forests of Siberia, none of them communicating with each other, all of them responding to the same reduced solar input, recorded 536 in the same narrow, scarred language. The worst year rings are often measured in fractions of a millimetre. What the ice and trees together provide is something the written record alone could never give. Independent, non-human corroboration. Procopius could have been exaggerating. Cassiodorus could have been writing for a rhetorical effect. But the ice doesn't have a rhetorical agenda. The tree grew, or it didn't. And what both of them say, in their different chemical languages, is the same thing the monk said in Latin. Something went very wrong, beginning in 536, and it lasted for years. If you thought 536 was bad, and it absolutely was, here is the information that history perhaps should have buried in a footnote but didn't. It got worse. Around 539 or 540, a second massive volcanic eruption, possibly in the tropics, delivered another aerosol injection into the stratosphere. The cooling that had begun in 536, which had barely started to ease, was abruptly refreshed. Temperatures that had cautiously begun to recover dropped again. Harvest that had timidly started to improve failed again. People who had spent 3 years slowly rebuilding their food stores, their strength, their reasonable expectation of continued life found themselves starting over. The phrase "decade of darkness" is sometimes used by historians for this period, and it is not an exaggeration. From roughly 536 to 545, the Northern Hemisphere experienced a sustained climatic disruption that no living person had any framework to understand, any tool to address, or any realistic hope of waiting out. The psychological dimension of the second eruption is, in some ways, the most devastating part. The first years of the crisis, 536, 37, 38, were terrible, but they were survivable partly because people could tell themselves that this was temporary. Bad years happened. The sun had dimmed before. Briefly, the cold would break. It always had. The stores would recover. The children would eat properly again next year. This was the story that kept people functioning through the first wave of famine, and it was not an irrational story. Most climatic anomalies do resolve. Most bad years are followed by better ones. But by 539, the story was becoming harder to tell convincingly. The crops had been bad for 3 years running. These stores were at levels that nobody's grandparents had experienced. Animals were thinner than they should have been going into yet another cold season. And then, just as the evidence was tentatively suggesting a slight recovery, just as the tree rings were beginning to show marginally wider growth bands, just as someone somewhere was allowing themselves to think that maybe the worst was over, the second eruption hit. The ice core record for the period around 539 to 540 shows a second significant sulfate spike. The tree rings from 540 and the years immediately following drop back to near minimum widths after the brief uptick of the late 530s. The physical record is unambiguous. A second climatic blow landing on a population that had not recovered from the first, and arriving in exactly the same years that the plague of Justinian was beginning to spread through the eastern Mediterranean. For the people living through this sequence, famine, partial recovery, second eruption, renewed famine, plague, the absence of any framework for understanding what was happening must have been its own particular torment. They couldn't know it was two volcanoes. They couldn't know it would eventually end. They just knew that the world had stopped working in the ways it was supposed to work, and had been not working that way for years, and showed no signs of starting again. There are limits to hope under those conditions. There are limits to everything under those conditions, and somehow people kept going anyway, which is the part of the story that deserves a longer look. Here is a strange and specific footnote to the story of the 530s. Ice core analysis from this period reveals a dramatic drop in airborne lead particles across Europe. Lead pollution, in the ancient and early medieval world, came primarily from one source: silver smelting. Silver was the backbone of the Roman and post-Roman monetary economy, and producing it generated significant lead byproducts that ended up in the atmosphere. When the lead levels dropped suddenly in the ice core record around 536, it tells a very particular story: that the silver smelters stopped running, that the economy contracted so severely that even the production of money became unviable. It is one of the more quietly devastating data points in the record. A civilization so disrupted that it stopped making its own currency. The lead came back, eventually. It always does. But for those years in the middle of the 6th century, the silence in the ice is the silence of an economy that had simply given up trying. Silver smelting in the ancient and medieval world was a noisy, hot, fuel-intensive process. You needed ore, you needed charcoal in enormous quantities, you needed workers with specific skills, and you needed a functioning economy at the other end of the production chain that would actually use the silver you produced. Take away any one of those requirements and production stopped. The mid-6th century managed to take away most of them simultaneously. Charcoal required healthy forest management and the labour to do it. Labour required workers who were alive and fed. A functioning monetary economy required trade and commerce, and the kind of surplus production that generates the need for a medium of exchange. The volcanic winter and plague knocked out all three supports at roughly the same time. The lead signal in the ice cores is remarkable for its precision. Researchers working on Greenland ice cores in the early 21st century were able to resolve the lead record at the level of individual years, and what they found was a drop beginning around 536 that continued and deepened through the plague years of the 540s, reaching a low point that would not be seen again until the later medieval period. It is, as historical data goes, extraordinarily legible. The economy turned off. You can see it in the ice. You can date it within a few years. It is one of those moments where modern science reaches back across 15 centuries and confirms, with chemical precision, what the chronicles only hinted at. What the absence of silver production meant in practical terms was a scarcity of coinage that compounded the already severe economic disruption of the famine and plague. Trade requires a medium of exchange. Barter works for local transactions but breaks down at distance. An empire the size of Byzantium ran on silver, on the ability to pay soldiers, collect taxes, purchase supplies and move resources across enormous distances through the mechanism of monetized exchange. When the silver stopped flowing, all of those systems became harder to operate. Soldiers who weren't paid reliably became soldiers who might not stay loyal. Tax collection in kind, rather than coin, was logistically cumbersome. The whole administrative machine ran rougher, required more friction, accomplished less per unit of effort. The lead came back. The smelters eventually restarted. The economy eventually recovered enough to make silver again. But the gap in the record, those years of clean ice, years when the atmosphere of Europe contained almost no lead because almost no silver was being produced, is a chemical portrait of collapse. Not dramatic, not visible to the naked eye, just a quiet change in the composition of the air that fell as snow and was preserved in a glacier for 1,500 years, waiting to be noticed. The ecological disruption of 536 wasn't limited to human agriculture. The broader ecosystem took a hit that rippled through every level of the food chain. Migratory birds whose routes and timing were calibrated to temperature patterns found themselves arriving in the wrong place at the wrong time. Insects, critical for pollination, already stressed by the cold, crashed in population. Fish stocks in rivers and coastal waters shifted as temperatures changed. And for the livestock that early medieval peasants kept not just as food but as heat sources, draft animals and walking capital, the bad harvests meant insufficient fodder, meaning animals went into winter thin and vulnerable. Cattle died in unusual numbers. Sheep, smaller and hardier, fared better but not well. Pigs, who would eat almost anything, demonstrated their evolutionary wisdom. For a farming family whose entire wealth consisted of a few animals, a bad winter that took the cow wasn't an agricultural setback. It was a financial catastrophe from which recovery might take years. The relationship between 6th century farmers and their animals was fundamentally different from anything a modern person would recognize. These were not pets, and not quite possessions in the way a piece of furniture is a possession. They were capital, labour, insurance and food supply rolled into a single breathing creature. The ox that pulled the plough was also in extremis the emergency food supply. The cow that produced milk and butter was also the source of the next ox, the calf that would replace her when she aged out. The flock of sheep was simultaneously the wool supply, the dairy supply, and the walking savings account. Losing an animal to a bad winter was not a setback you absorbed and moved on from. It was a hole in the system that took years to fill. Fodder, the hay and stored grain that kept animals alive through winter, was drawn from the same agricultural surplus that fed the human population. In good years, a farm produced enough grain and hay to feed both. In the bad years of the 530s, it produced enough for neither, and the allocation decisions that resulted were genuinely agonizing. Feed the children or keep the ox alive to plough in spring. The question answers itself in the short term. You feed the children, but the long-term consequence of a dead ox was a spring ploughing season done by hand, by exhausted and underfed people, producing less than a well-ploughed field would have yielded. The decision that saved the children this winter might cost them next winter. Wild animal populations were not insulated from the disruption either. Prey species that depended on summer plant growth found that growth reduced and delayed. Predators that depended on prey species found their food supply contracted. Fish in rivers and lakes responded to the temperature drops in ways that altered the timing and location of spawning runs that communities had been fishing for generations. The peasant who walked to the same stretch of river in the same week every spring because that was when the fish ran, and who needed those fish to supplement a grain supply that was already running low, found the fish not there, or late, or sparse, for reasons they had no way of understanding. The ecosystem's recovery, when it eventually came, lagged behind the climate recovery. You can't simply return a depleted fish population or a thinned-out woodland ecosystem to full productivity because the temperature came back up. The living world recovers at its own pace, through its own mechanisms on a timeline that doesn't consult human needs. For the people of the mid-6th century, the practical experience of this lag was another layer of deprivation, extending beyond the period of the worst cold. A world that was warming back up but hadn't yet become generous again. Archaeology has a way of making absence visible. In the mid-6th century, across parts of Europe and the Middle East, settlements that had been continuously occupied for generations simply stop yielding archaeological evidence. Pottery sequences end. Building phases don't continue. The middens, the refuse piles that archaeologists love because they're essentially a timeline of daily life, go cold. Not every case represents plague or famine specifically. Some settlements were already marginal before 536, and the decade of darkness simply closed a door that was already swinging shut. But the sheer number of sites that show abandonment or severe disruption in this period tells a consistent story. People left, or they died, or both in that order. The fields they cleared went back to scrub. The roads they maintained became paths and then nothing. A village that had existed for 200 years could, in the space of a single catastrophic decade, become the kind of thing future archaeologists find accidentally, in a field centuries later. Archaeologists have a term for the specific type of evidence that signals a community's end. The abandonment assemblage. It is the collection of objects left behind when people leave in a hurry, or leave permanently, or simply stop coming back. Broken pottery not replaced. Tools left where they fell. Hearths that went cold and stayed cold. Grain storage pits that weren't emptied, which means the people who stored the grain weren't there to retrieve it, which is always a statement about urgency. A full grain pit in an abandoned settlement is one of the more poignant things the archaeological record produces. What makes the 6th century abandonment pattern distinctive is its scale and its distribution. Village abandonment happens in every era. Settlements fail for all kinds of reasons across all of history. but the concentration of abandonments in the mid-6th century, across geographically separate regions with no direct communication, suggests a common cause rather than a series of local accidents. In Britain, in Gaul, in the Balkans, in Anatolia, sites that had been continuously occupied through the late Roman and early post-Roman periods show disruption or termination in the same narrow window of decades. The common cause was the climate and the plague and the famine that connected them. Some of the disappeared villages were eventually reoccupied, generations later, by people who had no particular knowledge of what had happened there. The new settlers found the old field boundaries, the old building outlines visible as soil marks, and sometimes the old grain pits, and they built their lives over the ruins of the previous ones without necessarily knowing they were doing so. The palimpsest of human habitation is thick in the landscapes of Europe, layer over layer of people trying to make a life in the same places, for the same reasons, across deep time. Other sites were never reoccupied. They became the kind of place that local tradition remembered dimly, a haunted field, a hill where old stones kept turning up in the plough, a name on a medieval map referring to a settlement that no longer existed. The people who'd lived there left no monument, no inscription, no named record. They left a cold hearth and a full grain pit, and a silence that the grass eventually covered. History doesn't always record who was there. Sometimes it only records that someone was and then wasn't. And there is something worth sitting with in that. These were not marginal people. They were not footnotes waiting to happen. These are communities, with disputes and festivals and the specific knowledge of which field drained best in spring, and who made the best bread and whose word you could trust. All of that was lost, not because it wasn't worth keeping, but because the circumstances of the mid-6th century didn't give it room to survive. The disappeared villages of this period are one of the quietest arguments for why history matters, not because the powerful deserve to be remembered, but because the ordinary do too, and mostly weren't. Here is a question that historians don't always ask, but probably should. Why did some people survive? In the epidemiological randomness of bubonic plague, luck played an enormous role. Whether the infected flea found you, whether you had a genetic variant in a specific immune gene, whether you happened to be in the right place when the wave passed through. But survival also had a social and economic component that was far less random. Communities with functional grain stores survived famine longer. Communities with clean water sources physically separate from their waste had slightly lower plague mortality without knowing why. Communities with strong mutual aid networks, where sick households were fed by healthy ones, where orphaned children were absorbed by neighbours, where nobody was allowed to quietly starve alone, came through with more members intact. None of this required understanding germ theory. It just required the kind of ordinary human solidarity that is, it turns out, one of the most effective public health interventions ever discovered. The genetic dimension of plague survival is one of the more quietly remarkable stories to emerge from modern genomic research. Yersinia pestis interacts with the human immune system through a specific receptor pathway, and people who carried certain variants of the CCR5 gene, a mutation that also confers some resistance to HIV, which is a genuinely strange footnote, had a measurably better chance of surviving bubonic plague. This variant exists in European populations today at a frequency that is higher than would be expected if it had simply drifted there by chance. The most likely explanation is that plague selected for it across multiple epidemic waves, beginning with the plague of Justinian and continuing through the Black Death. The survivors of 541 were, in a very literal biological sense, partly selected by the disease that killed their neighbours. But biology was only part of it. The social structures that shape survival were, if anything, more powerful in aggregate than the genetic lottery. A community that had built up grain stores across several good years before 536 hit had a buffer that a community living hand to mouth didn't. A settlement whose waste disposal kept sewage away from the water supply had lower rates of the intestinal diseases that compounded famine mortality without anyone understanding why. A household with extended family networks, more people, more labour, more redundancy in the event that any one person got sick or died, was structurally more resilient than an isolated nuclear unit facing the same crisis alone. The communities that came through best were often the ones with the most developed norms of reciprocity, the obligation to share food with a neighbour in need, to take in the children of the dead, to pool labour during illness. These were not just moral preferences in the 6th century. They were survival technologies, refined over generations of agricultural uncertainty, precisely because the people who practiced them survived bad years better than the people who didn't. You don't need a public health degree to notice that communities where people help each other tend to have fewer deaths. You just need enough bad years to select for the behaviour. What the survivors passed on was not only genes and grain. They passed on the practices and the norms and the deep communal memory of what it took to get through a decade of darkness. That knowledge, informal, embodied, transmitted through example and instruction rather than written record, was itself a form of inheritance. The 6th century was terrible. The people who came out the other side of it were, in ways both biological and cultural, shaped by the experience of having done so. They were not lucky to have survived it. They were competent. There is a difference. Prayer in the 6th century was not a passive or abstract activity. It was urgent, specific, and conducted with the desperate energy of someone who genuinely believed that the right combination of words, ritual, and personal sacrifice might actually change the outcome of history. In Byzantine churches, the liturgy was supplemented with special litanies for relief from plague and famine. Processions wound through city streets, carrying relics of saints with reputations for intercession in exactly this kind of crisis. Saint Sebastian, later famous for being shot through with arrows and surviving, was particularly invoked against plague. In the countryside, local shrines received offerings of the last food people had, which is an act of faith so extreme it almost defies commentary. What they got for most of the 530s and 40s was more of the same. More darkness, more hunger, more plague. This did not, on the whole, destroy faith. It redirected it, deepened it, and in some cases produced the kind of intense religious creativity that surfaces whenever humans find themselves in situations they cannot control by any other means. The specificity of 6th century prayer is worth pausing on, because it is so different from the vague spiritual gestures that modern secular life tends to associate with the word. When a Byzantine congregation gathered to pray against the plague, they were not expressing a general sentiment of hopefulness. They were conducting a negotiation with the divine, a structured transaction in which specific prayers, specific saints, specific rituals, and specific sacrifices were matched against specific requests, according to a theological system that everyone present understood and believed in. The relics that were processed through the streets were not symbols. They were contact points with genuine sacred power. the saint whose intercession was invoked was understood to be literally present and capable of intervening. This matters because it tells you something important about how people navigated the psychological burden of living through the decade of darkness. When you believe that your suffering is both purposeful and addressable through the right forms of devotion, you have a framework for action in a situation that would otherwise be pure helplessness. You cannot plant grain that will grow without sun. You cannot cure plague with herbs. But you can pray harder, fast longer, give what you have left to the church, process through the streets in the cold with a saint's relic held above your head. These actions did not stop the famine or cure the plague, but they gave people something to do with their hands and their fear, which is not a small thing. The saints who gained particular prominence during the mid-6th century reveal something about what people most needed. Cosmas and Damian, twin physician saints, patrons of healing, saw a surge in devotion that speaks directly to the medical helplessness of the period. People who had watched physicians try and fail with everything they had turned to saints who were, according to the theological understanding of the age, physicians of unlimited competence. The prayers didn't cure the plague, but the cult of the healer saints gave communities a locus for their need, a place to bring their most desperate requests, and sometimes, in the cases where patients recovered through the body's own mechanisms, an explanation for why. What the unrelenting nature of the disaster did produce over time was a refinement of theological thinking about suffering that became foundational for medieval Christianity. The question of why a good God allowed innocent people to suffer on this scale, the question that 536 posed in the most acute possible terms, generated centuries of theological response. The answers weren't satisfying exactly. They never entirely are. But the asking of the question, at this scale, with this urgency, shaped the intellectual and spiritual landscape of the centuries that followed in ways that are still traceable today. 6th century medicine was operating with tools and frameworks that were approximately as useful for bubonic plague as a wooden spoon is for brain surgery. But let's give the physicians credit for trying. The dominant medical tradition was still Galenic, built on the theory of the four humours, the idea that health was a matter of balance between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Plague, in this framework, was understood as a disturbance of the humours caused by corrupted air, miasma, rising from the earth. The treatment followed logically from the diagnosis, even though the diagnosis was completely wrong. You bled the patient to reduce excess blood. You purged them to remove corrupt humours. You fumigated sick rooms with strong-smelling herbs to counteract the bad air. None of this helped. Some of it actively made things worse. The physicians who kept showing up anyway, who kept trying, who kept sitting with dying patients in plague wards when every instinct for self-preservation suggested a long vacation in the countryside, deserve a footnote in history that they mostly don't have. Galen of Pergamon had died 3 centuries before the plague of Justinian arrived, but his medical system was so thoroughly embedded in the educational and intellectual culture of the Byzantine world that it remained essentially unchallenged. This is not because people were stupid. It is because the Galenic system was internally consistent, had a long track record of handling the ordinary medical problems of the ancient world reasonably well, and was supported by the most prestigious institutions of learning available. You don't abandon a theoretical framework just because it fails in an extreme case, especially when you have no alternative framework to replace it with. That is not how intellectual history works in any era. The treatments deployed against the plague were therefore treatments designed for a humoral imbalance, not a bacterial infection. Bloodletting, the removal of what was understood to be excess blood, was performed on patients who were already fighting a systemic infection that required every resource their immune systems could muster. Taking blood from a plague patient is, from a modern perspective, something very close to the opposite of helpful. Purging, which involved giving patients substances that induced vomiting or diarrhea, removed fluids from bodies that needed hydration. Fumigation with aromatic herbs, juniper, laurel, myrrh, was based on the correct intuition that the disease had something to do with the air, even if the mechanism was entirely wrong, and was probably the least actively harmful of the available options. Some physicians, working empirically in the way that good practitioners in any era eventually do, noticed patterns that pointed towards something closer to the truth. Procopius and others observed that the plague seemed to move from person to person in ways that suggested direct transmission, that being near the sick increased your own risk. This observation, noted without theoretical framework to explain it, occasionally produced practical responses. Isolation of the ill, avoidance of the dead, the very early and incomplete precursors of what would eventually become quarantine practice. These measures helped at the margins. They weren't understood, they weren't systematically implemented, but they were noticed and occasionally acted on, and that counts for something. The physicians who died of plague, which many of them did, left behind a profession that was simultaneously inadequate to the task and absolutely essential to the social fabric that held communities together through the crisis. What a 6th century doctor could provide was presence, organisation, the authority that medical knowledge conferred, and the willingness to keep trying in conditions that were, by any reasonable measure, hopeless. They were not able to cure the plague, but they showed up. In a decade of darkness, that was not nothing. History does not end with catastrophe, even catastrophe on the scale of 536. The decade of darkness eventually lifted. The volcanic aerosols settled. The sun returned, gradually, to something like its normal output. Temperatures began to recover in the 550s, and with them, slowly and unevenly, so did agriculture. The plague didn't disappear. It would recur periodically for the next 200 years, but its worst waves passed. Populations that had contracted began, generation by generation, to recover. And the world that emerged from the crisis was different from the one that had gone into it. The Byzantine reconquest of Italy, already struggling, effectively collapsed. New power structures emerged in the vacuum the plague left behind. Some historians argue that the decade of darkness contributed to the conditions that made the rise of Islam possible. A world with weakened empires, disrupted trade, and populations desperately looking for new frameworks. The darkness reshaped the map. It does that. The recovery was not a return. That's the thing about catastrophes of this magnitude. They don't reset the clock to the moment before they happened. They create a new starting point, different in population, different in political structure, different in the distribution of power and wealth, and different in the collective memory of what the world could do to you if it felt like it. The 6th century that emerged from the decade of darkness was a thinner, harder, more suspicious century than the one that had walked into 536. That is not a tragedy exactly. It is what adaptation looks like from the outside. The demographic collapse caused by the combined effects of famine and plague had redistributed labour and land in ways that, over the following generations produced structural changes of their own. In regions where population had fallen sharply, land that had been carefully farmed and managed reverted to a less intensive use. Grazing rather than tillage, woodland rather than field. The agricultural intensification of the late Roman period, which had pushed cultivation onto marginal lands, partially reversed. This was not prosperity, but it was in some respects a more sustainable relationship between a reduced population and the land it lived on. The political map of Europe and the Near East that emerged from the long crisis of the mid-6th century was substantially different from the one that had entered it. The Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy, already at war with Byzantium, was destroyed by the combined pressure of military campaign, famine and plague. The Frankish kingdoms of Western Europe, less exposed to the plague's worst waves by virtue of their northern position, emerged from the period in a stronger relative position. In the east, the Sasanian Persian Empire, Byzantium's great rival, was similarly devastated by plague, leaving both exhausted empires facing a 7th century in which neither had the resources to dominate the other. Into that exhaustion, in the 630s, rode the armies of a new faith from Arabia, and the world changed again. The historians who argue that 536 set in motion the conditions for the rise of Islam are not making a simple causal claim. They are pointing at the way that catastrophes of sufficient scale hollow out the existing order and create spaces that new things can fill. The decade of darkness didn't cause Islam, but it weakened the empires that might have contained it, disrupted the trade networks that had maintained the old order, and left populations across the Near East and Mediterranean exhausted, reorganized, and in some cases genuinely ready for something new. The darkness passed. The world it left behind was not the same world. It rarely is. 1,200 years after the worst of it, scientists pulled a core of ice from a Greenland glacier and found the whole story preserved in chemical layers no thicker than a breath. The sulfur from the eruption, the lead silence of the stopped economy, the slow return of normalcy, everything that the monks had struggled to describe in words, everything that the farmers had survived without understanding, everything that the plague had taken, all of it was sitting in the ice, waiting with perfect patience to be read. There is something almost unbearably moving about that. The people of 536 had no idea what was happening to them. They had no volcanology, no climate science, no epidemiology. They had faith and stubbornness and each other. They survived or they didn't, but the ones who did kept going, kept farming, kept writing, kept praying, kept making the simple daily choices that are, in the end, what civilization is actually made of. The ice remembered, and now so do we. The lesson, if there is one, is not a comfortable one to extract. It is not simply that catastrophes happen and people survive them, although both of those things are true and both are worth knowing. The lesson is more specific and more difficult. That the world can change suddenly and completely, for reasons that have nothing to do with anything you did or failed to do, and that the only meaningful response to that reality is to build the kinds of communities and the kinds of habits that make survival possible when, not if, it does. The people of 536 did not choose their catastrophe. They did not vote for the volcano. They did not decide to have a famine or a plague or two of each, or a second eruption just when the first was beginning to ease. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives, farming the same fields their parents had farmed, praying in the same churches their grandparents had built, watching the same seasons turn with the same reasonable expectation that the seasons would continue to behave more or less as they always had. And then they didn't. And the people had to figure out in real time, with no instruction and no framework, how to live through something their entire world told them wasn't supposed to happen. What they built under those conditions was not heroic in the way that stories usually mean when they use that word. There were no great battles, no famous speeches, no single moment of triumph that can be pointed to and celebrated. There was just the daily, grinding, unglamorous work of staying alive and keeping other people alive, sharing what little there was, maintaining the social fabric, one act of reciprocity at a time, writing down what was happening so that the future would know, keeping the fire going when every reasonable argument suggested letting it go out. The ice doesn't know any of this. It just preserved the sulfur and the lead and the quiet chemistry of a world in crisis, the way ice does, indifferently and perfectly. But we know it now, and knowing it, understanding that the worst year in human history produced people who got up the next morning and tried again, is the kind of knowledge that is not only historical, it is, in the most practical sense, instructional. The decade of darkness ended. The sun came back. The fields were planted again. The children who had grown up in the cold became the adults who built the next century. They did it without knowing that future scientists would drill down through 2,000 years of snowfall and find the evidence of what they'd survived, perfectly preserved, waiting to be read. They didn't need to be remembered to keep going. They just kept going, and the ice remembered for them. Let's talk about the generation that didn't choose any of this. The children who were born into the decade of darkness didn't know a world without fog, without thin harvests, without the specific background anxiety of a household that was always calculating how much was left. They grew up in the version of normal that 536 created. A normal defined by cold summers, rationed grain, the smell of smoke and sickness, and the particular silence of a community that had lost people and hadn't finished processing it yet. They didn't remember the before. They had no before. The world they were learning to navigate was the world the volcano and the plague had made, and they were learning to navigate it with the tools their parents handed them. Stubbornness, frugality, an almost pathological attentiveness to the signs that a bad year were coming, and a deep, unsentimental understanding that nothing was guaranteed. Childhood in the 6th century was already a compressed and pragmatic affair by modern standards. Children were expected to contribute to household labour from the time they could hold a tool, which was early. There was no extended period of protected development, no formal education for the vast majority, no cultural expectation that childhood was a time of play and exploration separate from the adult world. Children worked alongside adults, learned by watching, and were considered ready for adult responsibilities at ages that would now be considered alarming. The decade of darkness accelerated this compression further. A famine childhood was a childhood in which the gap between what was needed and what was available was a daily visible fact. Children who grew up watching their parents make rationing decisions, who eats more, who eats less, what gets saved, what gets used now, absorbed a relationship to scarcity that became foundational. They didn't theorize about food security. They felt it in their bodies, measured it in the weight of a bowl, learned it in the difference between a full winter and a thin one. What these children became as adults was a generation of extraordinary practical competence. They knew how to read a harvest before it came in. They knew which wild plants were edible and in what preparation. They knew how to bank a fire, manage a grain store, spot the early signs of animal illness. They knew, above all, how to cooperate, because they had grown up in households and communities where cooperation was not a virtue, but a survival mechanism, practiced daily and passed on deliberately. They also carried something harder to name, something the archaeology and the thin written record can only gesture at. A kind of vigilance, a reluctance to assume that good conditions would continue, a tendency to save rather than spend, to build rather than display, to maintain rather than expand. The psychological legacy of a famine childhood is not simply trauma, though it includes that. It is also a recalibration of baseline expectations, a permanent adjustment of what you believe the world owes you downward and what you believe you owe the world in return upward. These were the people who rebuilt, not the emperors or the generals or the theologians whose names made it into the historical record, the children who grew up cold and hungry and watchful, who became adults in a world that was slowly, unevenly warming back up, and who applied everything the dark decade had taught them to the work of putting things back together. They didn't know they were making history. They thought they were just farming. They were doing both, as people always are whether they know it or not. Before 536, the trade routes of the late ancient world were among the most impressive things human civilization had ever built. Not in the sense of physical construction, though some of the roads were extraordinary, but in the sense of a system. Silk moved from China to Constantinople along the overland routes through Central Asia. Grain moved from Egypt to Rome, and then to the armies stationed along the Rhine and the Danube. Spices arrived from India through Persian intermediaries. Amber came down from the Baltic. Ivory came up from sub-Saharan Africa. The whole interconnected network hummed with the movement of goods, money, information and people, and it was so deeply embedded in the economic and political life of the Mediterranean world that most people who depended on it had no idea they were depending on it. It was just how things were, and then 536 happened, and it got very, very quiet. Trade requires several things that the decade of darkness systematically removed. It requires surplus, something to sell beyond what you need to survive. It requires transport capacity, the ships, the carts, the animals, the roads, all maintained and operational. It requires people, merchants, sailors, porters, money changers, the entire human infrastructure of commerce. And it requires safety, the basic expectation that you can move goods from one place to another without being robbed, taxed into insolvency, or killed by plague before you reach your destination. The famine and the volcanic winter attacked the surplus. The plague attacked the people. The combination attacked the safety, because a world with reduced food and reduced population is a world with increased desperation and increased violence. Merchant accounts from the mid-6th century, where they exist at all, describe routes that had become unreliable, markets that had contracted or disappeared, trading partners who had died or moved or simply stopped responding. The papyrus records from Egypt, which are among the most detailed documentary sources for this period, show commercial activity dropping sharply from the 540s onward, a contraction visible in the frequency of transactions, the volume of goods moving and the prices being paid. Less was moving, less was being produced, less was being sold. The numbers tell the story with the same flat precision as the ice cores. The longer-term consequence of disrupted trade was a shift in what people made and where they made it. When long-distance trade collapsed, communities turned inward. Local production replaced imported goods. Skills that had atrophied because it was cheaper to buy a thing than to make it were laboriously reconstructed. This is not a romantic process. It represents a genuine reduction in living standards and a loss of the specialization and efficiency that trade makes possible. But it also produced over generations a more self-sufficient economic landscape, one in which the failure of a distant supply chain was less immediately catastrophic. Some of the trade routes never fully recovered their pre-536 volumes. The overland Silk Road, disrupted by the combined effects of plague along its corridors and political instability in the Central Asian states it passed through, entered a long period of reduced activity. The sea routes of the Mediterranean contracted and then slowly expanded again as populations recovered. What the Decade of Darkness proved, in the most expensive way possible, was that a world deeply connected by trade is also a world in which a single catastrophic disruption, whether a volcano, a plague, or a famine, can travel almost as freely as the goods themselves. The 6th century learned this the hard way. It is not a lesson the world has stopped needing to learn. At some point in the mid-550s, not a single day, not a dramatic moment, but a gradual, cautious accumulation of evidence across weeks and months, people began to notice that the sun was warmer. Not warm, not reliably warm, not warm enough that you'd call it solved, but warmer than it had been. The grain was coming in slightly better. The livestock were going into autumn in slightly better condition. The children were slightly less hungry than they'd been the previous winter, and the previous winter before that. There was no announcement. Nobody rang a bell. But there was a shift in the quality of the daily calculation that farming people ran constantly in the background of their lives, the arithmetic of enough, and the shift was towards something that rhymed, faintly, with hope. Hope, after a decade of darkness, was not a simple or comfortable thing. It had been disappointed too many times. The partial recovery of the late 530s had produced hope, and then the second eruption had punished it. The brief improvements that preceded each new wave of plague had produced hope, and then the plague had returned. By the time the sun was genuinely, lastingly returning in the 550s, the people who had lived through the whole sequence were cautious in a way that was almost superstitious. They didn't celebrate early. They watched the sky with the specific attention of people who had learned, at significant cost, not to trust it. The physical experience of recovery after malnutrition is not dramatic. It is slow and incremental, and accompanied by a persistent anxiety that it might reverse. Bodies that had been undernourished for years didn't simply bounce back when food became available. Children whose growth had been arrested by famine grew, but unevenly. Adults whose immune systems had been depleted by years of inadequate nutrition remained vulnerable to infections that a well-nourished person would have shaken off. The first better harvests fed people, but they did not immediately restore the physical reserves that years of deprivation had consumed. Recovery was measured in seasons, not days. The emotional texture of the returning warmth is harder to reconstruct, because the people who felt it left fewer records than the people who wrote about the catastrophe. But there are traces. The construction records that begin to appear again in the late 6th century, churches being built, monasteries being expanded, infrastructure being maintained and improved, suggest communities that had regained enough surplus and enough confidence to invest in the future again. Investment in the future is one of the clearest signals that a community believes it has one. You do not build a church you expect to be empty in a decade. You build it because you intend to still be there. The sensory experience of a warm summer, after years of summers that weren't, is something that no 6th century writer described directly, probably because it was too ordinary to describe, or rather because it had become, after so long, so extraordinary that there were no adequate words for it. The smell of warm earth in July, the specific weight of a grain head that had filled out properly, the sound of livestock moving through pasture that was actually green. These are the textures of normal, and normal, after 10 years without it, must have landed like something very close to grace. What the return of the sun gave people more than anything else was the ordinary again. The unremarkable, taken for granted ordinary of a summer that was warm enough, a harvest that was adequate, a winter that was survivable on normal preparations. The people who had lived through the darkness did not take it for granted again. How could they? They had learned, in the most thorough way available to human beings, exactly what ordinary is worth. The answer, it turns out, is everything. Here is the thing about history's worst year. It didn't end when the calendar turned. 537 arrived and the fog was still there. 538 arrived and the grain was still thin. The plague came in 541 and stayed, in waves, for 200 years. The decade of darkness wasn't a single catastrophe with a clear finish line. It was a sustained unravelling that remade the world it moved through, layer by layer, in ways that took centuries to fully trace. The Rome that had teetered through the 5th century finally fell away entirely in the West, replaced by a patchwork of successor kingdoms that would eventually become medieval Europe. The Byzantine Empire that had reached so confidently for reconquest in the 530s spent the next century contracting, adapting, surviving in a form its founders would barely have recognized. The Near East reorganized around new spiritual and political centers. The map of the world was redrawn, not by armies alone, but by cold and hunger and a bacterium too small to see. The phrase late antiquity, the period historians use to describe the centuries between classical Rome and the medieval world, contains within it the story of 536 and what it did to the transition. The ancient world was already changing before the volcano. The classical institutions, the trade networks, the population densities, the intellectual culture of the Mediterranean, all of it was in a process of transformation that had been underway for generations. But the decade of darkness compressed and accelerated that transformation in ways that made it irreversible. The world that might have evolved gradually over another century was instead pushed abruptly and violently into a new configuration. What was lost is worth naming. Not just the people, the hundreds of thousands who died in the famine, the millions who died in the plague across its 2-century recurrence, but the continuities that their deaths interrupted. Knowledge held in the heads of practitioners rather than written down, and which died with them. Agricultural techniques adapted to specific microclimates, refined over generations, lost when the communities that held them dispersed or disappeared. Trade relationships built on years of trust and mutual understanding, severed when the trusted parties died. Languages, dialects, local traditions, the entire texture of a particular way of living in a particular place, sometimes simply gone, because not enough people survived to carry it forward. And yet, the word that keeps appearing in the historical and archaeological record of the post-darkness period is not loss, or absence, or silence, though all three are there. The concept is persistence. People persisted. Communities that had been reduced to fractions of their former size persisted. The monastic tradition that preserved knowledge persisted. The agricultural practices that worked persisted, refined by the selection pressure of catastrophe into something leaner and more resilient. The faith persisted, changed by what it had been asked to explain, but not broken by the failure of explanation. The simple human insistence on continuing, on planting in spring even when last spring's planting had come to almost nothing, on building even when the last building had been abandoned, on having children even in a world that had recently demonstrated its willingness to take them, persisted, as it always has, as perhaps the most fundamental human characteristic of all. The darkness left behind a world that was smaller, harder, and in many ways diminished. It also left behind the people who had survived it, carrying everything they had learned, moving into a future that none of them could see, but all of them were building one ordinary day at a time. You could call that resilience. You could call it stubbornness. In the 6th century, there was very little difference between the two. Here is the part nobody tells you about history's worst year. It is also, quietly, one of the most human years on record. Not because of the emperors or the eruptions or the elaborate theology of suffering, though all of those are part of it, but because of what ordinary people did when ordinary became impossible. They improvised, they shared, they buried their dead and planted the next season's seed in the same week, sometimes in the same motion, the grief and the hope conducted simultaneously, because there was no time to do them separately. They made decisions with no good options and chose the least bad one and lived with it. They watched the sky with a wariness born of experience, and they got up anyway, and they went to the field anyway, and they did the thing that needed doing anyway, because the alternative was not doing it. And they had already seen what that looked like. 536 does not appear in most history textbooks. It is not the kind of year that gets a chapter. No famous battle, no famous name, no single moment around which a narrative can be organised neatly. It is instead the kind of year that saturates the background of everything that came after it, invisible and pervasive, the way a cold that settles into your bones in winter is still present in the way you move come spring. The Byzantine Empire that reshaped itself through the 600s, the early medieval kingdoms that emerged from the wreckage of Rome, the spiritual movements that swept through populations left searching for meaning by a decade of inexplicable suffering, all of them were shaped, in ways their participants couldn't see, by what 536 started, and the decade that followed it finished. It is tempting to look for a silver lining, because that is what human beings do with painful history. And there are things that can plausibly be pointed to. The monastic culture that preserved classical learning, the theological developments that gave Western Christianity some of its most durable ideas about suffering, the genetic legacy of plague-selected immunity, the agricultural knowledge that famine refined into something leaner and more resilient. These things are real. But the honest version of the story doesn't need a silver lining to be worth telling. The decade of darkness is worth knowing about not because it produced something good, but because it is a record of what human beings actually do when the conditions for ordinary life are systematically removed. And what they do, with uncomfortable consistency, is continue. Not heroically, not without cost, not without loss that can never be fully recovered, but continue. The fire gets banked, the seed gets planted. The monk sits at the desk. The mother feeds the children before herself. The neighbour carries the body of the neighbour who died. The community does not dissolve, even when dissolution would be the rational response to everything being asked of it. You're listening to this from inside a set of circumstances that would be, to the people of 536, essentially miraculous. The warmth that surrounds you right now, the insulation, the heating, the blanket, the reliable expectation that tomorrow will have food in it, is the accumulated result of every generation since the darkness that managed to make things incrementally better. Not always, not in a straight line, not without reversals that were, in their own moments, as devastating as anything the volcano produced, but on the long curve, upward, always, eventually, upward. The year 536 is history's worst year. It is also, in its own bleak and stubborn way, proof that worst years end. The fog lifted. The sun came back. The people who were still standing looked at the world the darkness had made and decided, without fanfare and without any particular confidence that would work, to try again. It always comes back to that. It always has. And so, here we are, at the end of 536, at the end of the fog and the famine and the plague and the second eruption that arrived just to make sure nobody was getting too comfortable. At the end of 30 segments about the worst year in human history, which you have somehow listened to while lying in a warm bed, under a clean blanket, in a room that has not yet been visited by a single bubo or a rat with bad intentions. Take a moment with that. Really. The people we've been talking about tonight, the Byzantine merchants watching their markets go quiet, the Irish monks writing failure of bread in precise bewildered Latin, the farmers standing in cold July fields doing arithmetic with no good answers, the children who grew up measuring hope in the width of a grain head, none of them had what you have right now. Not the warmth, not the food security, not the quiet confidence that tomorrow will more or less resemble today. They had fog and faith in each other, and somehow against the specific odds that the 6th century assembled against them, it was enough. That is the thing worth carrying with you into sleep tonight. Not the plague, not the darkness, not the catalogue of miseries that 536 produced in such impressive variety. What is worth carrying is the persistence, the stubborn, unglamorous, completely uncinematic persistence of people who kept going when the conditions for keeping going were objectively terrible. They didn't do it because they knew it would work out. They didn't have access to the ice core data. They couldn't see the tree rings narrowing and then widening again. They just did what came next because there was a next, and it needed doing, and they were still there to do it. So tonight, as you let your body sink into whatever softness is available to you, and it is more softness than most of human history would consider believable, maybe spare a quiet thought for the ones who didn't have it. The ones who banked the fire in a frozen hut and prayed the embers would hold till morning. The ones who planted the spring field on a body that hadn't had a proper meal in 6 months. The ones who wrote down what was happening carefully and without drama, so that 1,200 years later, a scientist could pull a core of ice from a glacier and confirm, yes, this was real, they were there. It happened exactly as they said. History is full of years. Most of them pass without leaving much of a mark. 536 left a mark in ice, in tree rings, in the bones of children, in the restructured map of an entire civilization. It left a mark in every monastery that survived to preserve the knowledge, and every community that held together when falling apart would have been easier, and every ordinary person who made it through and passed on the knowledge of how. You made it through tonight's history. They made it through the actual thing. The least you can do is get some rest. Close your eyes. Let the warmth do what warmth does. And somewhere, in the quiet dark behind your eyelids, maybe hear the faint sound of a medieval ember catching. One more night survived, one more cold morning still to come, and someone already up, already tending the fire, already making sure there would be a next. There always was. Good night.